Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. So just a quick kind of overview of the what I'll be covering today in my presentation. I'll just give a quick background on the current flight and duty time regulations that we have in Canada and some of the challenges that we've been experiencing. I'll be discussing some deviations that we are exploring regarding more of a holistic approach, and then other types of deviations for our individual air operators and some of the next steps. So in Canada, our flight and duty time regulations came into force in 2020 for our airlines and in 2022 for air taxi and commuter. And so these regulations, they all follow the same rules. So it's for both international and domestic operations, as well as for both scheduled and non-scheduled operations, which has introduced some challenges simply because airline work is very different than air taxi and commuter, but they're all subject to the same rules. In terms of our prescriptive regulations, we have very strict limits and we have schedules built into the regulations, which have introduced some unintended consequences. And for our fatigue risk management system regulations, we've been focusing solely on flights rather than an operation. And due to the diversity of operations taking place in Canada, that's introduced some challenges. And so I'll just explain some of the work that we're doing to look for improvements. So in terms of the holistic approach that we've been exploring, we have a series of tables for the maximum flight duty periods that look very similar to this. It depends on how long your flight is. It depends on the number of segments. And there's all these various columns and tables that can be quite confusing and complex. And some air operators have pointed out that there's actually been some gaps by taking an unexpected technical stop. It introduced an extra hour of maximum flight duty period, which was not the intention. And so we've been working very closely with civil aviation medicine. We have a neurologist who specializes in fatigue in order to explore how we could simplify this table and focus more on kind of boundaries rather than hard limits, as was shown in the Slido poll that somebody had mentioned, that just because it's legal does not mean you won't be fatigued. So we really want to help improve the culture around that. So with this approach, if it were to move forward, any air operator could apply. And in order to apply, you would need to have an approved fatigue management program. And so kind of how we're referring to that, it's a little bit like an FRMS light. So there'd be some requirements around non-punitive fatigue reporting and some analysis that would be required. And our approach really is to protect the window of circadian low and as well as address some gaps around late and night duty. We found that initially the regulations really focused solely on start times, and there's a lot of considerations that about end times as well. So this is a draft table that we've proposed that is going through approvals. And so we're looking at a few various items and regulations around this. For example, a new approach to how to account for workload with segments. So we've been exploring using this, reducing your maximum flight duty period by 0.2 hours once you've gone over 5 segments. And then if you've gone over 10, you would just automatically reduce your maximum flight duty period by an hour. And so this would help address the fact that we have both small and large air operators that are subject to the same rules. It'd be very easy to calculate. You don't always need a computer. But then, of course, we have our major airlines that have the sophisticated systems to account for their workload. There's a series of limits on consecutive FDPs, particularly around when you're ending between midnight and 1:59. And then, of course, limitations around any maximum flight duty period that would be touching the window of circadian low. One of our the big areas is this row here for a maximum flight duty period of 14 hours, and that's to address some of the diversity of operations in Canada. We have a lot of air operators that'll be doing small island hopping, and they're working with a maximum flight duty period of 13 hours. But as you are aware, aviation can be unpredictable at times, and so they are sometimes need just slightly over 13 hours. And so what we're trying to introduce with this is that in some cases you plan for 13 hours, you might have to go slightly over, So there is the option to use a 14-hour flight duty period at times, but there's limits on a single segment because we don't want them flying across the ocean without augmenting the crew. And there's limits on the consecutive times you can do this, and you cannot go into the window of circadian low with that flight duty period. And then, of course, with the last row, again, it's touching the window of circadian low at one point, so you're limited to consecutive flight duty periods. So essentially, we'd be requiring air operators to analyze specific items in their fatigue reports, and so this is something new that is not a current requirement in our prescriptive regulations. So that will also it will raise the bar for some of the air operators that have yet to implement a safety management system, but then it also accounts for our more sophisticated air operators that already have a robust SMS. But we expect them to report on the type of risk mitigations they'd be implementing. Through this process, we as the regulator would be collecting a series of information in order to either introduce new risk mitigations more broadly, but also to inform future regulatory amendments. One of the biggest concerns from our air operators with our current regulations is that it's all fine when you read the legal text, but in actual practice, it's quite challenging for them to implement. And so this is our attempt to collect data to inform the amendments that are more evidence-based rather than what was decided, in a boardroom in a legal drafting. We've also been doing some work with our statisticians at the Department of Statistics Canada in order to inform how we can collect better data and analyze the data in a more meaningful way that reflects the type of operations that are actually taking place in Canada. And I'll get into that in a little more detail for some of the deviations that we're working with individual air operators. Next slide. So in terms of the work with our individual air operators, this is with our fatigue risk management system framework. So we are exploring improvements with these regulations. We have some areas where we don't align with ICAO, and so we're looking to improve that. And one of those is that approving the FRMS system upfront. So that is something that we are exploring to implement. And we are looking to use a better way of understanding the data and how it can be used, making sure it aligns with the safety management system data collection. And so that's something that we really want to make sure there's integration, there's no duplication. And so essentially we're testing a new approach that focuses on the entire operation rather than an individual flight. And so what we mean by that, I had mentioned earlier that for our FRMS, in our regulations, we've actually built in that they need to collect data on one flight, and then there's certain parameters around that, which has actually introduced some unintended consequences because in some cases, an air operator may come forward and it's not about a maximum flight duty period that they're looking to deviate from. Perhaps it's a rest period or the number of consecutive flight duty periods, depending on the operation that they're looking to carry out. So this approach will allow us to collect more data so that we can draw more accurate conclusions. And so some of this work is really with our colleagues from StatsCan is to move away from a kind of a study that resembles what you could do in a lab versus the real world operation, because we've almost built into our regulations as if it was in a lab, that type of study. And when we have been going to analyze the data, it hasn't been as meaningful because there's certain things that we can't control, such as the age demographics and the voluntary data collection. And so our statisticians had advised us to kind of take a step back about what we can collect, how we're going to collect it, and then how we're going to analyze it. So we're looking to explore with some individual air operators how we can improve this. Again, would be before we would make any final amendments. So it would be a bit of a pilot project. And so, of course, the main principles behind this are focusing on the guidance provided by ICAO, that we'd be looking at the safety performance indicators and risk tolerances of the air operator and come to an agreement between us as the regulator and our air operator about what would be acceptable depending on the type of operation. And so what we're exploring for the first pilot project is using a 14-hour flight duty period, which for a Caribbean turn with some of our air operators. Essentially, they look to go down from Canada to Mexico and back within a 14-hour flight duty period. And due to different times of the year and the weather, sometimes that can be done under 13 hours and sometimes it's done just over 13 hours. But because we have certain risk mitigations that allow us to feel safe under certain conditions, that we wanted to test this new approach with our FRMS framework before moving towards more of our outlier operations that are more complex. Because at this current moment, what air operators have been using our FRMS framework for is to deviate from a 13-hour flight duty period to 13 hours and 15 minutes, when our real intention behind FRMS was for long range and more complex operations. And so for our next steps, we're expecting a decision on the holistic approach in the coming weeks. And then if all goes as planned, we'd be looking to issue some preliminary findings around how that is going in the fall, and hoping to launch some individual deviations for our individual air operators later this month. And we are continuing to review other regulations and provisions to inform improvements. We've kind of reached a point where there's a number of issues that are causing us to take a step back and look for improvements. And so that is it. So I don't know if there's